So my presentation today is a little different from the name that I had originally. It's the Houston Freedom Colony Diaspora Grassroots African American Planning and Preservation. So I'm Andrea Roberts, and I, as I said, am a PhD candidate, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about my doctoral research and also about my personal story because they're very much intertwined. And so I'm at the University of Texas School of Architecture, under which I'm also working with both the historic preservation programs and the community regional planning programs. So you have a lot of historians here today who I admire immensely, but I am very much in the field of planning focused on planning history. So let me give you kind of a roadmap for what I like to do. I know I have the whole hour, but what I'm very interested in doing is finding ways to interact and break it up and make it interesting. So here's what we're looking at. I'm going to give you a framework for how I approach my work, where I situate it in the field of planning and historic preservation and African American studies. And then I'm going to talk more specifically about the subject matter we're talking about today, which are Houston metropolitan area freedom colonies, just to give you an idea of sort of the scope of those. Talk to you about my own freedom colony story, and then talk to you more specifically about my research. So, okay. So when I say framework, what do I really mean? So my work is what I call insurgent planning history or ethnohistory. And I'm principally interested in, making sure y'all see a heading there, I'm interested in insurgent planning history, meaning history that exists outside the confines of the state. Ordinarily, we think of planning as, okay, you have a municipality, you're interested in people who are paving and building roads, but I'm interested in planning that comes from below, that's more grassroots in nature. And I'm also interested in planning that emphasizes community building over building buildings. They're intertwined, but I'm very interested in my work in community building and exposing the hidden milestones embedded in that history. And I look at everything with what I call a critical lens, not that I'm judging everything, but more that I'm looking at issues of power. I'm looking at something that kind of decenters the great men of planning idea that we have of what planning is. And so a lot of my work is heritage, ethnography, and community development oriented. And the way that I look at community is through a concept of diaspora. Can anybody tell me, when you think of diaspora, what do you think of? When I say that word, what comes to mind? It's not a test.
Dispersion of some formerly ethnic homogeneous group.
Okay. Dispersion of a group. Anything else? Any other example of a diaspora? The African diaspora. You said something very interesting. You said the African diaspora. So in my work, I look at the African diaspora, of course, which is very rooted in the African or the Atlantic slave trade. However, I contend that we do have internal diaspora. We have African American diasporas, most obviously the Great Migration, and you'll see more as we go on, different types of African American diasporas. So this is a quote that gives you an idea of what I mean. So I'm interested in new African diaspora scholars are concerned with diasporic survivals and adaptations, like you mentioned when we talk about African diaspora. Can we prove that something that we African Americans are doing here directly is derived from Africa? There's that concept. But there's also people who are rightly concerned with the vehicles for freedom and independence. Escape is one thing, but how did maroon and free communities rationalize or conceptualize freedom and institutionalize self-government? How did they come to make community? How did these networks of disparate peoples come together to make community? So I am very interested in, as I said, planning history, and of course in that the building blocks of planning in these historic communities. So I wanted to give you if I say insurgent planning, I want to give you an example of what I consider that. One of which would be one of the greatest contributions to planning is something that's somewhat interracial in nature, and that would be the Rosenwald School programs. How many people are in here are familiar with the Rosenwald schools? Most people nowadays are. Most people nowadays are. And the thing that I find most interesting about Rosenwald schools is that they were an interesting approach to financing a public resource that wasn't publicly available due to segregation. So more specifically, what I mean is, let's consider that in 1932, by the program's conclusion, it had produced 4,977 new schools, 217 teachers' homes, 163 shop buildings, constructed at a cost of over $28.4 million to serve 663,615 students in 883 counties in 15 states. That's a massive operation. And Rosenwald, who was the founder of Sears, was responsible for some of the funding, but there was matching funds from these very small, disparate communities that sprung up after emancipation. But these are one of the building blocks of those communities, because if you have a school, if you have a church, and even a little corner store, you have a community. The other contributions, cooperatives and mutual aid. These organizations are key to sustaining these places and these communities. Yes, churches are, but these mutual aid societies are essential to providing, again, the services that your normal planning apparatus on a city level, and we know in Texas, on the county level, we have no planning. So in the absence of those gaps in service, to put it politely, we have these cooperatives and mutual aid societies acting as social networks, providing social services, burial insurance, infrastructure beautification projects. They were, buying, cooperatively. So certain groups would go to major cities and pool their resources to buy major resources cooperatively. So there's a range of functions that these privately grassroots-oriented groups that had memberships across several states, they had quite the reach.
I was just...
Oops, sorry about that. So before I go to that, I want to play you, what I'm going to play you next before I actually go through the entire slide, is one of the many descendants of freedom colonies. Before I explain to you what they are, I thought I'd just have a descendant go ahead and explain it to you. So that's what you're going to be hearing. It might be a little loud, though. Let's see.
I was just out 2 days ago at Clear Creek Community, about halfway between here and Mount Union, which was founded by one of his daughters, Missouri Rogers, who married Hans Rogers, and I found their grave, and that community has disappeared. The church has been abandoned, and basically nobody lives there anymore. Other people have bought up the land, which has happened, by the way, to most freedom colonies. The truth. I mean, it's just the fact of history. In 1895, and this was in Freedom Colony, about 30% of all private land was owned by African Americans. Today, about 1% of the land is owned by African Americans. So that tells you sort of what happened to freedom colonies. What happened was quite simply the Great Migration. Families couldn't sustain themselves on land, so they moved. They moved to Houston. Here in Texas, they moved en masse to California. So if you got relatives in California, that's what happened.
They're simply African American settlements founded after emancipation. That's what freedom colonies are. And so They are an all transects, and that's fancy planning talk for their urban, their rural, and their suburban. They existed everywhere, and there are various waves of their founding, and I'll talk about that a little later too. Now, in this book, Freedom Colonies, in the back, there's a wonderful directory of 400 plus freedom colonies that existed in the state alone. I want you to take that in first. In the state of Texas alone, as we rightly so give a lot of attention to places such as Freedmanstown in 4th Ward, to all number of places that were mentioned today, consider the entire state of Texas, 400 plus. So that is interesting, but in the course of the past 2 years, I've detected 520. And I learn of a new one every day in my ethnographic field work, actually talking to, meeting, and working with descendants of these African American settlements. So let's talk more specifically about Houston, as you came to expect coming to this presentation, Houston metropolitan area freedom colonies. And I'm going to contextualize as best I can some of the kind of freedom colony milestones will be on the top, and on the bottom will be your general kind of race-oriented milestones in history. Excuse the difference in font has made everything kind of move a little differently for some reason, but we'll just work with that. So at any rate, we could see the basic milestones here. And then you'll note sort of a proliferation of settlements that are popping up here. 1866, of course, Freedmanstown, Clarksville in Austin, 1871. We have Gregory Institute opens in 1870. Black Seminole Camp, which is much farther south from here, in 1870. Independence Heights, unfortunately annexed in 1929, but I don't know how many know that Independence Heights was a freedom colony that was its own incorporated city with its own mayor. And there's a number of people doing extensive research and work on Independence Heights. I find very interesting, the ward system was actually abolished technically in 1915. But it's interesting how much those political organizational mappings continue to stay with us. Someone mentioned to me earlier today, Barrett Station, 1889. Oops. But you can also notice some of these, the Slocum Massacre, all of these, the nadir of race relations sort of overlapping with the development of these freedom colonies. And when I say nadir of race relations, I'm speaking of a period of extreme, oppressive violence and intimidation. From 1877 to 1917, the first wave of extreme repression of any African American gains. So you could see with that then the eventual kind of decline, including the Slocum Massacre, which is in a freedom colony where tons of African Americans were driven off of their land. So we had both the obvious that the individual Herman, who was talking earlier, shared with us the obvious reasons for the end of these places continuing to exist. We have the Great Depression, we have the Great Migration, often resulting partly from the Great Depression. We have also, as I mentioned, great extreme violence. However, a number of these places have continued to exist in more rural areas because of their seclusion and their initial founding away from everyone for obvious reasons. Safety. So here is, and it may be hard to read it, but what I want to illuminate here for you is just to look at the Houston metro area. And I determined Houston metro area, the counties contained here are part of the Houston-Galveston Area Council, so it's a way that we define a region presently. So if we look just in that region, in these counties, we can see in Harris County there are 9, and I always anticipate when I do my presentation, there'll always be someone else that raises their hand and says, no, you forgot. So that's fine with me. And in Fort Bend County, of course, our esteemed colleague here, Portia, spoke extensively about DeWalt. And then there's a total of 5 in Fort Bend County, for example. But you can see sort of the variety. In unincorporated is a designation for a place that's actually counted in the census as a place. But we have no established status for most of these places, which makes it very hard to see them, define them, access them, make them legible to formal planning and formal presentation, preservation. And as we're talking about all of these building blocks of Freedom Colony history, I don't want to overlook a scholar who I advise everyone reads if they want to know more about Houston settlement and their building blocks of community. And it's The Other Migration by Dr. Pruitt. And these are just an example of some of the organizations that have been essential to Houston area freedom colonies and building blocks of these communities. Now I just want to go ahead and just tell you my own freedom colony story and how I came to this conceptualization of the work that I do. So on the right is Ruby Brown. She is my great-grandaunt. She owned a cafe that fed most of the workers at the Imperial Sugar Plant outside Sugar Land. And she lived in an area called 5th Street. It's both a street and a place. And this was a freedmen's colony. And that's where a majority of my father's side of the family relatives are all buried and all lived. And it was where I was brought home from the hospital when I was born. And right now it's surrounded by Missouri City and Stafford and a little bit of Houston somehow. And then on the other side is Hester Allen, who's standing. Hester Allen is my great-grandmother. And that young girl enjoying the tea cake is me. And I'm sitting on my great-great-grandmother's lap.
Oh my gosh.
And so I always show this picture because it's a grounding for, as I talk about these sort of technical definitions of what a freedom colony is and what can be included and what's not. I came to know this very intimately in losing relatives in my family and beginning to do family history. And the more, anybody who's done family history, it just kind of grows tentacles and you go in a million directions. But what I learned about these women is that they come from a long line of women who were very organized. They were very essential to the ongoing sustaining of their communities. One freedom colony, Riceville, we know Riceville Church is in southwest Houston, near South Gessner. That area was once a freedom colony known as Riceville. So I discovered all of this quite by accident. As I said, when people were passing in my family, I noticed that there were all these funeral programs. And, these are not things that you pay much attention to. I had my grandmother who said, I said, do you have any pictures of these relatives? And she gave me pictures. And she's like, I think I have something else. And she came out with just bag after bag after bag of funeral programs. And I thought to myself, wow, she's a collector. I never knew this about my own grandmother. And these are not things we normally think of as substantial planning documents, or rather of substantial historic documents. But these ephemera are very, very essential in understanding these early communities. So on the back of one of the programs, it said FIS, internment at FIS Cemetery. I said, where's that? They said, that's a cemetery on 5th Street, in the 5th Street area. What does FIS stand for? No one knew. It took 3 or 4 different telephone calls to finally figure out that it stood for Farmers Improvement Society. This was a mutual aid society that operated in several freedom colonies and major cities throughout Texas. And it was a network of, as I said, farmers and sharecroppers, but sharecroppers who were trying to make the transition to ownership and getting out of what they called the credit system. They actually talked about abolishing the credit system. This would be in 1889 that this organization was started. And it was women in this organization, unlike other uplift groups, were not necessarily educated, were not necessarily all married, but they were all people who were essential to their communities, and I'll explain how they were essential in a moment. So that's the cemetery, which looks like nothing, but has been especially informative for me in understanding the Fifth Street community. This area that's now 90% Latino was once majority African American owned, ownership. It had a school and a church, of course, that anchored it. And this organization, Farmers Improvement Society, had 21,000 members actually in 3 states. And one of the biggest things they did, of course, was establish cemeteries and allow people to make it affordable for them to get buried. So that map is a fuzzy map of what the Fifth Street boundaries actually are. As you can see, it doesn't really belong to anyone. Like most unincorporated areas, planning overlooks them because no one is really responsible. In this instance, you have 3 different jurisdictions responsible, which often means no one's responsible. They have poor infrastructure, all number of problems. So when I encountered all this and I actually started doing a planning project with people in the community today in the Fifth Street area, when I engaged in that process and got deeper and deeper into the history and understanding of the area, I thought, you know, there must be other freedom colonies that might have similar problems. And I wonder how they functioned. And again, just to go back to the Farmers Improvement Society for a moment, the women were essential in financial literacy. So they used household budgeting to ensure that they were able to afford being able to transition from sharecropping to ownership. So for example, that budget there is an excerpt from a paper that was presented by these women at a conference. So these are working class rural women from Kendleton out in Fort Bend County, for example, who made presentations and talked about how to organize your budget in such a way that you could save over a certain period of time and save enough money to leave the sharecropping system and buy land and grow your own food. And as you see here, this is what they said. It sounds like something maybe Beyonce would say now. We're after property, new methods, and bank accounts. That's what we're after. They're not after, you know, are you proper, are you Victorian, are you respectable? That's the least of the worries. So we're all business. So after I got really fascinated with these organizations, and I'm sorry to go in many different directions, but my point is to sort of tell you my journey in getting here, because I think it's important for people in history to contextualize their work and not always have complete distance from what they're doing. So after I did this investigation into the Farmers Improvement Society, developed papers on it, presented on it, I realized I was more interested in the places that this organization was operating within. I thought, you know, where are the other freedom colonies? I got the book Freedom Colony. It had information about Farmers Improvement Society in it and the significance of it to these settlements. But I wanted to learn more about the settlements. And that brings me to talking about my dissertation work. So I was working for the city of Houston before I decided to go to back to doctoral study, but I got so completely engrossed in family history, these settlements, learning more about them, that I stopped working in the housing department and decided to go back to get a doctorate in community and regional planning because I saw fundamental parts of planning history and heritage that weren't there and became very committed to exposing that. So this is Space City to the Piney Woods, and it gives you a context for how I describe the Freedom Colonies, the particular ones that I've been studying. They are located in the Piney Woods. Is anyone here familiar with where I'm talking about when I say Piney Woods? East Texas, deep East Texas. I always have to clarify because East Texas is very large. So deep East Texas is the area that I'm speaking of. So that, yes, the next thing I'm about to say. So if we are to get on 59 north from here and travel to Livingston, and then we would exit Washington Avenue, which is also known as US 190. We would then take that east an hour and a half and arrive in Jasper. That's deep East Texas, and that's where I've been doing my research. I've been doing it in Jasper County and Newton County, places that we do not normally identify with African American self-sufficiency and self-governance and empowerment and strength. But I was introduced to these communities through a fellow scholar and have been amazed at what I found, and I hope that you all are too. So let me give you an idea of what I'm fundamentally trying to do in my study. These are kind of the issues and challenges I'm specifically interested in as a planning scholar, as a planning history scholar. In looking at these places, freedom colonies are invisible, unmapped, or erased. That is, those that we are unable to specifically see on a Texas Texas Department of Transportation map, things that we don't see in a road atlas, we don't see on Google. They're not there. And so if they're not there, they're not on these documents that formal planning sees as essential to determining whether or not a place exists, then how do you make it exist to them? And what were their placemaking building blocks? What's the mechanism for me finding out how these places were made and how they're sustained today? Not very much documentation, as Dr. Petrie said earlier today. There's often very little tangible evidence directly from African Americans during the period post-emancipation. We have oral history in very few circumstances, but we don't have very much. So it's going to be hard to find that out. What are people doing today? As I mentioned, what are the preservation what are people doing to conserve both buildings and heritage in these places today? And then why does this even matter to my field? What is the significance of this to formal planning and preservation? More specifically, what might they do differently if they have this information? And what are the different things that they should be thinking about in light of this information? So this is all I'm asking. How do these descendants use their memory, meaning, and values to mobilize the diaspora, their descendants scattered from East Texas to Houston? How do they mobilize that diaspora of scattered peoples to achieve their planning goals? Because this is something that all societies have. They have meaning, they have values, they have memory. And so this is what I believe to be true, and I'm trying to establish how true it is in various places. If you have memory in the form of foundational stories, I'll tell you more about those later, but a foundational story is something like Manifest Destiny. It's not tangible at all, except it's extremely tangible because it actually catapulted the expansion of the West, this ethos. If you have foundational stories that hold these memories and values, those memories and values should foster attachment to place through participation in whatever celebrations they have, social networks, annual rituals, and that should encourage participation in planning and preservation activities. And those things might be conservation, development, financing, community building. And then all of that should somehow catalyze positive planning and preservation outcomes. So that's what I think. And so I use as my fundamental tool asking people their foundational stories of their communities. So these foundational stories, as I mentioned, of course, manifest destiny. These are stories that are a source of meaning and esteem, and it's the way people understand reality in their relationship to nature and how the city came to be, how the nation came to be. And they shape people's goals and missions, and sometimes they're oral tradition, sometimes they're written, and sometimes they're even performed. Not necessarily performed by an actor and actress, but they're actually, through some annual ritual or periodic moment, commemorated. So what I'm going to do today is share with you a lot of these stories, but I thought what I would do to take a little break here is to ask anyone here if they have a foundational story of the place that they come from that they think is interesting. Or it could be a foundational story you've come across that you think is interesting. It could be the origin story of a place or of your family and how it came to be where it is today. Yes.
So the church that I'm working with in Fort Bend was founded in 1869 by former slaves. And a lot of the descendants of that church still reside in Fort Bend County. And so one of the largest celebrations that they have each year is the church anniversary, where they come back and they retell the story of their founding, and a lot of their preservation efforts do center on saving the building itself, but then also collecting oral histories to tell the church story.
So you said something very interesting, as you said that they do it through these annual celebrations, and so that fundamentally became how I did my research. One of the best ways to actually connect with these communities was to live in these communities for the past year and a half, off and on. And also spend a lot of time with people that no longer live there, live here in Houston, but call those places home. And the way I did that was going to their church celebrations, their homecomings, their reunions, because these are the places where they reenact the origin of these places to keep people connected from all over. So I'm going to share with you a few from Newton County. Harold Odom, who is from a place called Shankleville, which is the first settlement. It's actually the way that I formulated my theory. I actually saw in action how they used their foundation story to keep people connected, to keep people coming back, to form their identity, and to also make sure that they are preserving their family homestead. It's a National Register of Historic Places site now. I'll be talking to another woman speaking about life in the settlements. And then talking not just about memory, but place preservation. What are people actually doing to preserve these places? In Dixie Community, in Herman Wright, in Mount Union, and Bill Roseman in Magnolia Springs. So again, to go back to the geography, just to remind everyone, most of my work has been done in Jasper County and Newton County. Jasper County and Newton County were once one county, and they split in 1845. And then also consider Newton County is exactly on the border with Louisiana. So you have an interesting culture that's very reminiscent of some Louisiana culture as well. And the other thing to remember is it's extremely remote. So you'll drive long distances, and these are areas that are complete forest. And down the Highway 63 corridor are all of these different settlements throughout the woods that you don't know they're there unless you go to these celebrations, live with these people, and find out that there's hundreds of African Americans throughout the East Texas woods that have been there since emancipation. So these are some of those people. And again, the tie to Houston is that almost all of these people live in Houston part-time or full-time, but are dedicating themselves in this part of their lives. They're predominantly baby boomers, been very successful in Houston, very urbane, and are dropping everything and dedicating themselves to these places. I want to break for questions on anything so far, just to make sure everybody's with me. Yes.
So you mentioned that these places don't exist on maps.
Several of them do not. Some do, but several do not.
And they're unincorporated areas, so they're not receiving any services from county or the city. I think of Tamina, the Tamina area right out in Montgomery County.
Montgomery County, exactly,
And
yes.
it had no running water and
Mm-hmm.
no services. Are these places similar?
So in the instances, I'll speak specifically to the instances that or the people that I've developed relationships with in these settlements. The issue, one of the issues that they have with service is grading roads. So I stayed with a woman named Mrs. Palmer, back up in the woods, 2 miles going down this road. And there's so much dirt, it's so not graded properly, and it's chaos. I mean, there's so much, in terms of trying to drive down there, and you constantly feel like you don't know if you're going to the right place. So if you want someone to deliver social services, to Meals on Wheels, all of those things, and I've spoken to social workers, they have extreme difficulty accessing all the elders back in these places. So access is one issue to services, and also infrastructure, continual maintenance of infrastructure is an issue in a lot of these places, if that answers your question. One of the things that I am also working on is a typology of freedom colonies, because you can have a place name, and it could be a name that's associated with people that are not there anymore, but were there. You could have a place name associated with a place where it's still predominantly African American with descendants. You can have a place that is now subsumed by the local municipality. And so one of the things that I've been doing in going to these different these settlements is getting us to think more carefully about their differences and their nuances and how they might be categorized and looked at. Anything else before I go on? Yes.
You're not saying that these are people who are also outside of the purview of the U.S. Census, are you? They are counted, aren't they?
I have heard in some instances, and I'm speaking of the specific context that I've been studying, that people were overlooked for the census. But a lot of these people, as I said, are very urbane, and they're not like people who've been in the woods, for 80 years and never seen anyone. But there is a matter of getting what's due them, to speak, plainly, that becomes an issue. And census is, of course, an issue. Newton is the second least populous, I forgot what the first one is, but it's basically the least populous county in the state of Texas, which means they do not get very much money. Yes, ma'am. Oh.
I'm familiar, just because I have passed it for 40 years.
Kendleton in Fort Bend County, yes,
Fort Bend County,
is a city.
that is a city.
Yes.
They do have a post office, don't they?
They have a post office, they have a mayor, they have a government. They are an incorporated city.
And what about Elm Grove?
No.
It's just a spot in the road with a sign, right?
That's often what they look like. That's how they appear. They appear sometimes as a spot in the road with a sign. And because I don't know about you, but before I did this work, didn't have a tendency to go down every county road to see if that was an actual place, and it just wouldn't occur to me because we're always on our way from one big city to another. So it doesn't occur to many people to say, okay, that sign is here. I guess that means the whole community is here. It doesn't necessarily occur to people. So in that sense, if there's a county road before or after that sign, it may lead to a whole entire community. So just beware of that.
One more
Yes,
question.
okay.
So the people you're talking to, as you say, are more urbane, they have.
Some of them.
Right, but really the bulk of the population in these settlements are not, don't have that connection with bigger towns and cities. They've been there and they're for decades. I'm trying to get a picture of the population that you're not talking to. The ones that maybe don't have the connections with Houston or whatever.
So the woman I mentioned, Mrs. Palmer, has no connection with Houston, but for the purposes of today's presentation, to stay within the confines of today, I've focused just on those that have the connection with Houston because I figure that might be of most interest. But I can certainly talk to you afterward more about the other. Let me go ahead because I know I only have about 15 minutes left. So again, I really want to, as this gentleman said, where are we talking about? I want to make sure everybody's very clear on that. And this medley of a map that I've been building for some time of just this study area, the yellow arrow is pointing to a star, and that star is covering up a place called Shankleville, Texas. And that's sort of the focus of my work in terms of a base to work from. Founded in 1866 by former slaves. And I will in a moment tell you their beautiful foundational story. And what you see surrounded here are a number of freedom colonies. So when you click off, you know, how you can sort of have one layer that shows all of this, and when you turn it all off, it looks like nothing is there. A few of these, Shankleville has a marker. Some of these have markers, but a majority have no marker. But if you talk to people, they'll say, yes, I live in Biloxi. Yes, I live in Bull Run. I live, they tell you where they live, and this is where they live, in these places.
That are unmarked.
Some of which are unmarked. So then once I begin to visit these places, I begin to see how they actually operate. And they operate kind of like a plant called a rhizome. On the left, you see the rhizome, and on the right, you see the real live manifestation of this network. And that is a program for a homecoming. And for the past 70 some odd years, 77 to be exact, in Shankleville, all of these settlements come every single year. And they have a singing concert, and they go one by one by one, and every settlement goes to everybody else's. So that settlement goes to all the Weirgate churches, all the Liberty churches. They go to each other's. And the purpose of the homecoming is a very concrete purpose. It's productive nostalgia, okay? They are raising money for their cemeteries to make sure that the cemeteries have care. These are not automatic perpetual care places. They're cared for. And people who live here in Houston, when they die, they leave here and get buried all the way back up in the woods in these cemeteries. Several people do. So this is the homecoming, and that's kind of the visualization of what I mean by the diasporic network. Is you've got these people who come every year from all over to the homecoming. So you may have a population of 20. When you look in the census, there will be 20 people. Maybe you'll see 10 African American landowners or farm owners. But every year there are 200 people invested in this place, coming to this place, ensuring that the cemetery is cared for example. So we have a much larger constituency than we think we do for these places. So Schenkelville, as I said, has been kind of the focus of a lot of my research. So this is Harold Odom. Harold Odom is a very, very successful man. Sorry, this will be right side up in a moment. He's a very, very successful builder and lives in Missouri City, right outside Houston. And what he does is he goes every year and is responsible for taking people through the paces of this very exciting foundational story of his ancestors, Jim and Winnie Schenkel. Winnie was sold. They were slaves in Mississippi. Winnie was sold, taken to Texas, and Jim embarked on a 400-mile journey to Texas, swimming rivers. This is the story they tell every year. Every single person who's a descendant knows this story. Embarked on a 400-mile, the Mississippi, every river you could think of, they name. And she hid and fed him at a spring in Schenkelville. This is the spring. He takes people to the spring. So you actually go to the spring and he cups the water and makes sure everybody drinks it. And so you're connected directly to that legacy. And her master discovered him and purchased him. And then after emancipation, they were able to acquire land from the master. They squatted, essentially. That's how a lot of people attain land. And then they established Schenkelville. Okay.
You keep coming down here and bringing food, and I said, well, something's going on. And so she told it, and then he bought it.
Yeah,
Yeah, and reunited the family.
yeah.
So it has to be just an old groundswell of emotional on her part, and his part too. I mean, the determination.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very thick forest that we're walking through, so it's very hard to film because you're always feeling like you're going to fall. But this is the area, this entire area was full of houses at one time that composed this settlement. But the way that he keeps people connected is, for example, giving this tour. And this is them at their annual homecoming and on the land.
Yeah.
So I bring that up just in terms of what you think your preservation activity is. Some people it's a physical structure, some people it's a story, some people it's, genealogy, some people it's...
You know what,
what is it for you?
Mine, I think, is not so much a story, and it becomes a story. It's a story, but it's in making my family, I'm living the man in the mirror, making my family aware of their ancestry. That's how I see myself interacting. I'm the one who puts together do the research on Ancestry.com and put it with what my grandmother, I remember my grandmother saying, oh, this is that, and that kind of stuff. So I don't see it.
So I bring that up just in terms of what you think your preservation activity is. So that was Ms. Funderburk, and she lives at Cinco Ranch in a gated community, but she, with her daughter and their family, very comfortable living, very, nice place to live. But she's much more interested in making sure that they know that history, that they're not always comfortable, as she puts it. Here is a very interesting story about a place called the Carver School in Dixie Community. It was a Rosenwald school. Dixie Community is in Jasper County, about 10 miles outside the city of Jasper, in West Jasper County. These are all people who, Henry Hadnot used to run the housing department here in Houston. The McCraes, Bobby Hadnot, all these people have ties to Houston, lived here, what have you, but now they've pulled all the resources and went back to the school that they all grew up going to so that they could renovate it for some pretty exciting projects. What they're doing is actually making these available for youth in the area to get job training, to learn things like plumbing and Journeyman Electricity. They have all kinds of manner of visions for this place. And they're all individuals originally from here, great success in Houston, coming back committed to this space. This will be the last one I play because I know that we're nearing our end here and I don't want to hold everyone. Let's see. I don't think there's stories on here. So what they're going to say, I'll tell you the story rather than play it for you. This building until 1968 was used as the G.W. Carver School. After desegregation, the VFW, it became a VFW hall. Sounds like a wonderful, nice purpose for a building, but what they actually found out is that there were people gathering there who were allegedly Klan members. So if you can think of the pain of having been in a predominantly black school that you love and you cherish and have these memories around, this is part of their foundational story, the anchor of their community. And it was used for that purpose. How do they know that? I talked to several people that actually went in and were warned not to go in, who were African American, who were veterans. All of these are veterans who couldn't go into their own VFW hall because there were actual Klan meetings going on. And so they pulled all their money together. There are no grants involved here. There is no public anything. It's all them pooling their resources, rehabbing, cleaning, making this possible. This is Herman Wright. He is a descendant of Sherrod Wright, who is attained his land through a land grant. Sherrod Wright was, of course, white. His son had a relationship and had 3 African American children. When he died, when the son Solomon Wright died, he left those black children hundreds of acres in Jasper County, and it's now a historic ranch, the Wright Brothers Ranch. And this is Herman Wright, the descendant, who's reassembled all the different pieces of land that had once been sold off. And he leads tours. There's 6 different ecosystems. It's an amazing place that I stayed in. And this is Bill Roseman, who lives in Houston, but goes to Magnolia Springs to his home place, and he's holding some of the things that he grows and sells. We have a lot of farm-to-table farmers out here making a lot of money selling peas to Brennan's restaurant here in Houston. He cans, everybody there cans. So I know I need to wrap up. So basically, here's what I'm beginning to see. I'm seeing a wave of founding of the settlements in 1867 to 1890 that we have documented in books like Freedom Colonies. But there was a second wave of these same descendants, their children, founding other freedom colonies. They would come to homecomings and meet. It was sort of like a old-fashioned Match.com. You go to homecoming, you would meet people from other settlements, you would get married, and then you might go back to another settlement, or you might start another one, and that happened 1890 to 1930. And then we go to diasporic returns, or what I'm calling the homecomings and the reunions, 1930 to the present. And those are the greatest generation, some people call it the silent generation, 1924 to 1945. And then we have that intense out-migration. And what we see are neo-freedom colony settlement, diasporic return. All I'm saying there is that people are not only coming back, but they're also engaging in placemaking again. And those are our silent generation and our retiring boomers. My research consists of 35 interviews and attendance at 7 events, and the development of an event for Freedom Colony descendants to gather and share their stories, interface with Texas Historical Commission, learn about resources, and actually express directly to Texas Historical Commission and county historical commissions, what do we need, what's lacking, what are you not seeing? And these people are now gathering together and working on a number of things, organizing into an association, a statewide association. So this is a way that I'm learning about what the actual agenda is. And it's Tanya DuBose, as if on cue, who also is involved in the effort to start the Texas Freedom Colony Association from Independence Heights here in Houston. So part of what I want to continue to do for the association is research, capacity building, and of course, organizing. So this is an effort I hope to support even as I go on and teach and consult and do my own work. But this is just the beginning of a lifetime of work to serve this constituency. So I was going to go into more, but we're a little over time. I want to answer any questions. My last question was going to be if any of you have ideas of what should be on the Freedom Colony agenda, and to share that. But if you don't have that, that's fine. I can take any questions you have. And thank you very much for your understanding and patience with the technical problem.